Hello everyone, welcome to our series on American literary periods. In the previous episodes, we talked about the Native American and pre-colonial oral traditions, and in the second episode, we talked about the colonial and early national period. And in the previous video, I talked about American Romanticism. And now, this is the fourth episode. We are going to talk about Realism and Naturalism as a literary period in American literature. So some tend to call it realism, and some call it realism and naturalism. We'll get to know these details. So in this lesson today, I'm going to talk about the historical context of this period between 1865 and 1914. And I'll talk about realism and its sub-movements, such as naturalism and regionalism. And we'll talk about literature as usual. So we'll get to know some of the important realist authors and their literary works. Uh, the same for naturalist authors and regionalist authors. And we'll get to know about art and photography during this literary period. And we'll get a kind of review about the history of Native Americans. And I'll display some of the voices from Native Americans, especially during this literary period. And we'll talk about the transition toward modernism, which is the next literary period after this one. So, in order to understand literature during this literary period in American literature, we need to have an idea about the main incidents or the historical context of this literary period in order to have an idea about the complexities and the main incidents which affected the American society and, of course, literature at that time. So we can start with the year 1865, and I'll talk about the main incidents till 1914. And of course, I'll mention just some of the important events, not all of them. So in 1865, this year, we see the end of the Civil War and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the American president. This assassination added instability to the attempts of reconstruction of the American society. So, what is the reconstruction? This is an era called the Reconstruction era between 1865 and 1877. It witnessed many attempts to rebuild the South and integrate the freed slaves into the American society. And this era, unfortunately, witnessed many tensions and violence and the rise of some white supremacist groups. And in 1865 as well, we witness the 13th Amendment, and also in 1868, the 14th Amendment, and in 1870, the 15th Amendment. So, what is the significance of each of these amendments? So, the 13th one, it abolishes slavery in the US. The 14th one, it grants citizenship and equal protection under the law to former slaves. And the 15th one gives African American men the right to vote. So just men, they had the right to vote in 1870, according to the 15th Amendment. And in 1876, we have the Battle of the Little Bighorn between Native Americans and the new settlers. And the Native Americans achieved a great victory at that time. And we have the year 1877, as I mentioned a few seconds ago. It witnessed the end of the Reconstruction era. And we have an important act, which is in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act is considered as the first major immigration restriction in the US history, and it reflects the growing anti-immigrant sentiment at that time. So in 1886, we have the Haymarket riot in Chicago, which witnessed labor protests and had many violent incidents in 1886. And now we can talk about very important incidents in American history. We can start with the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was a battle between Native Americans and the new settlers in 1890. It took place in the Wounded Knee Creek near South Dakota in America. Uh, it is considered the symbolic end of Native American armed resistance. It was the last major battle. However, many other battles took place after that, but they were minor and limited. So this one represents the end of armed resistance of Native Americans. And also it marks the end of the spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance, a spiritual movement that frightened the US officials at that time. We have also another term which we call the Panic of 1893. This term refers usually to the major economic depression which affected workers and farmers across the US. And we have another incident, actually a very significant one. In 1896, we call it Plessy versus Ferguson. These are two names. So who are these two people? We have Homer Plessy, a mixed race man who deliberately and intentionally used to sit in like seats, only white seats, and he used like transportation that were only for white people or seats that were only for white people. So he was against this racial segregation. And Ferguson, his full name is John Ferguson, was the judge of the Supreme Court at that time, and he legalized this racial segregation. It was known as separate but equal. So this is an important incident which reflects the American society and racism at that time. Other important events that we can mention is the Spanish-American War between 1898 and 1899. The US defeated Spain in that war and gained overseas territories such as the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And it can be considered as the start of the American imperialism. And in 1901, we have the assassination of President McKinley. And in 1906, we have Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, a very important and significant novel. In this novel, he talks about racism and also exploitation of people. And in 1910, we have the Mexican Revolution and another important incident, which is the San Francisco's earthquake in 1913. And this year also witnessed the death of a lot of African Americans in the Atlanta race riots. And the last one that I'd like to mention is the start of World War I in Europe in 1914 as the US Marines invades and occupy Veracruz. So after we finished talking about some of the main incidents in American history and the historical context of America between 1865 and 1914, let's get started with our main topic, which is literature. So, realism as a literary period in American literature is marked by these literary pieces of literature. In 1855, we have Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and we have the poems of Emily Dickinson between 1860 and 1865. So these works can be considered as the earliest realist pieces of literature, and we can consider them as the beginning of realism and naturalism in American literature. And now we can talk about the movements or the subperiods, if you want to call it, of realism. So, realism is the umbrella term of this literary period. Some people call this literary period in American literature as realism. Some call it realism and naturalism. However, we can divide it into three sub movements. So we can start with realism between 1865 till the 1900s, which is the general or the umbrella term of this literary period. We have also regionalism between the 1870s and the 1910s. And we have naturalism, the last sub-movement, let's say, in 1880s till 1914. So let's get to know the differences between these movements or sub-movements. So we can start with the definition of realism, which is the main literary period or movement. Uh, this is considered a literary movement that aimed to depict everyday life and ordinary characters without romanticizing or idealizing them as Romanticism did in the previous literary period. And this movement, realism, it focused on the social conditions, class, and moral choices. Now, regionalism, or we call it local color, is a subset of realism. It portrays the distinct characteristics of specific regions, dialects, customs, or landscapes, and community life. Regionalism is often nostalgic and it focuses on vanishing ways of life. And we have the last one, which is naturalism. It is also considered an extension of realism, but it has more scientific and deterministic world view, and it emphasizes on the influence of the environment and social forces on our behavior. And it often portrays people as victims of larger forces beyond their control. So, realism is the main one, and we have regionalism, a subset of realism, and we have the extension of realism, which is naturalism. And I'll talk about the three of these movements later in this lesson, and I'll explain them in details. Now let's get to know their effect or their influence on literature. So these movements had their influence and effects on many aspects of life, including literature, of course. So realism focused on class, labor, race, and post-war life. Naturalism also portrayed the urban poverty, the exploitation, the industrial forces, and determinism. And we have regionalism, which paid too much effort to preserve disappearing local cultures. As you remember, it valued like vanishing ways of life. And also these three movements combined led to the transition to modernism in the early 20th century. We will talk about it in later videos. Now let's talk about realism and literature in realism. So we are talking about the key realist authors between 1865 and approximately till the 1900s. So we have the most important author in realism, Mark Twain, and his literary works, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In these literary works, we see many different themes and topics such as race, class, regional life. And we have also William Howells, and we have Henry James, and his important work, The Portrait of a Lady, and Daisy Miller. We see topics related to psychology, identity, and American versus European values as well. And we have Bret Hart, Rebecca Davis, and her work Life in the Iron Miles. In this literary work, we see themes related to industrialization, working class struggle, and gender roles. Now, let's talk about naturalism between the 1880s and 1940. Naturalism, as I mentioned, is considered as a sub-movement or sub-period to realism, or some consider it as a main period, so they call it naturalism and realism. So, the key naturalist authors, we can mention Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Jack London, and Hamlin Garland. We have many important works like The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. We have The Octopus by Frank Norris. We have The Main Traveled Roads by Hamlin Garland, and many other important naturalist literary works. So, naturalism or the naturalist authors talked about many different topics and themes. So, in their literary works, or what marked their literary works, are themes related to war, fate, natural determinism, desire, man versus nature, and economic hardships. It was among the most important topics in naturalism. So economic hardships, and also let's not forget the gender roles. Also, they are heavily mentioned in naturalist authors' works. So now let's talk about some of the prominent regionalist authors. Before we start, it's important to remember that regionalism is a branch of realism. Some even consider it just as a style of writing. So regionalism is the inclusion of regional dialects describing the settings or the landscapes of a certain region or area. And we have also the use of regional dialects. We see authors who are considered as prominent regionalist authors. We saw their names in regionalism and naturalism, such as Mark Twain and also Sarah Jewett and Hamlin Garland. And here, as you can see on the screen, each author talked in his or her literary works about their region. And we can also mention some of the notable works. I've already mentioned some of them in the previous slides. We can talk about A New England Nun by Mary Freeman, in which she describes the settings of the rural New England. Now, let's have a comparison between realism, regionalism, and naturalism to get rid of any confusions formed. So, let's start with the main focus of each one. So, realism is a truthful depiction of ordinary life. Meanwhile, regionalism focuses on geography, dialects, and culture in a certain region. Naturalism focuses on survival, determinism, and social forces. Now, the tone in each one is as the following. The tone in realism is objective, moral, and sometimes ironic. In regionalism, generally it is sentimental and nostalgic. And the tone in naturalism is often detached or analytical. Now, realism is the central movement or the umbrella term of this literary period. We call it realism between 1865 till 1914. Regionalism is a branch of realism or a writing style. Naturalism is a philosophical extension of realism. So, the key influences of each one in realism, we see civil war, democracy, and middle class issues. In regionalism, we see post war identity and local cultures. And in naturalism, we are introduced to Darwinism, poverty, and industrialization. And the typical characters in these literary works, in realism, we see middle class individuals with moral dilemmas, and in regionalism, we see colorful ruler types or eccentric characters. In naturalism, we see again working class or marginalized people struggling to survive. So, a quick recap. Realism is the main movement or literary period between 1865 till the 1900s or even 1914. And we have its branch, regionalism, and also another movement or sub-movement, which is naturalism. So, before talking about some of the voices of Native Americans in literature, let's get a kind of recap of the history of Native Americans. In the first episode, we talked about literature of Native Americans and the oral traditions. And then we talked about the colonial era and until the early republic. This period witnessed conflicts with European settlers from the 17th century until the late 18th century. So it witnessed many wars. You can see some of these wars written here. And we have as well the Indian removal and westward expansion between the 1830s and 1870s. Uh, this time witnessed some important events like the Trail of Tears, which forced the relocation of Indians after the Indian Removal Act. And we have also numerous wars. We can mention some of them, like the Red Clouds War. And we have another thing, which is the Indian Wars period between the 1870s and the 1890s. Here we have the final large-scale armed resistance. As I mentioned previously in this video, we have the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, and we have also the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, which, as I mentioned earlier, is considered the symbolic end of Native American armed resistance. So, Native Americans also had their own fingerprint in American literature in this literary period, realism. So, we hear many voices of Native Americans, such as Samohala and also Zita of course, my pronunciation is definitely incorrect because their names are in their own original language. So we have Charles Eastman and Nicholas Elk. Of course, they had two names, one original name and one kind of American new name. So we have Samohala is a religious leader who had really touching comments to Major McMurray, who was sent to negotiate with him during the last uh, few battles, let's say. And we have also Selim Hakka or Charlotte, known as Charlotte as well, and other names you can read here. I don't want to mispronounce them. So they had texts that are really significant and had really meaningful words that represented that era and the struggle between Native Americans and the settlers. So I mentioned the leaders Mohala from Native Americans, and we talked about his comments to Major McMurray. And I liked this quote and I wanted to share it with you to get an idea about the literary text that we are talking about from Native Americans at that time. So let me read it. This is my flag and it represents the world. God told me to look after my people. All are my people. There are four ways in the world: north and south and east and west. I have been all those ways. This is the center. I live here. The red spot is my heart. Everybody can see it. So after we talked about like literature in realism, naturalism, and regionalism, and we listened to some of the beautiful voices of Native Americans. Uh, this literary period specifically witnessed the invention of photography. So, photography, art, and art had big like presence during this literary period, and we have also photographs that represented some of the literary works or illustrations that uh, participated or added value to some of the literary works. So let's start with the photography's role. So after the invention of photography in 1839, during the Civil War, photography became a powerful tool for capturing objective reality. So we are living in realism and we have the invention of photograph. of photography, which captures reality as it is. So Matthew Brady's Civil War photos expose the brutal realities of war. You can Google these pictures or photos. These uh, photos actually shocked the public and demolished the romantic ideals of the previous literary period. And writers began to imitate this visual realism in literature. So photography participated in the rise of realism, and literature started to show rather than tell. So depicting life as it is. This is the core of realism. So this period witnessed the invention of photography, as I mentioned. So we have really wonderful photographs that tell us about life at that time. And there are many famous beautiful photographs that you can Google if you like. So I wanted to share some of the photographs that I liked, like this one, Nampio Decorating Pottery by Edward Curtis in the 1900s. Another picture or photograph that I wanted to share with you is this photograph. It pictures the moment when Major McMurray visits Samohala, the leader that I mentioned in the previous slides, the Native American leader. This picture is taken by James Mooney, and there is no accurate date of this photograph. So after we talked about photography, let's talk about painting and visual art during this literary period of realism. So the American realist painters, Winston Homer and Thomas Eakins, influenced the literary movement with their paintings. So their paintings focused on everyday people, everyday life, life in the rural areas, uh, labor life. So this visual realism shifted the focus from romanticism into realism, and people got like more interested in showing life instead of telling about life. So during this literary period, there were different types of paintings and illustrations. However, most of them tended to focus on details and to depict everyday life. So we have these examples by E.W. Campbell, which is an illustration of the story of Mark Twain's The Huckleberry Finn. Another example is this one, The Gross Clinic, this painting by Thomas Eakins. You can search for the story behind this wonderful painting. And we have also the Banjo Lesson by Henry Osawa Tanner. This is also a very famous painting that tells us about life that time. So as we approach the end of this lesson on realism, we need to talk about modernism. How was the transition towards modernism, which is the next literary period? So here by the early 1900s, this is the end of realism and the beginning of modernism. America at that time was experiencing these issues, which is rapid urbanization and industrialization. And we have growing disillusionment with traditional values, especially after World War One. And we have scientific and technological advances like Darwinism and Freud and Einstein's theories. So we have also the deep social changes due to the large scales of immigration, labor earnest, and the issues related to women rights in voting and owning property. So as a result, these all together like kind of pushed literature to evolve into modernism. So these figures or main characters can be considered as like the bridge figures from realism to modernism, like Stephen Crane and Henry James and Kate Chopin. So in the next lesson, I'll talk about modernism, but for the time being, I'll mention quickly some of the differences between realism or naturalism and modernism. So the form in naturalism is straightforward narration depicting details of everyday life. In modernism, we have fragmented structure, and the focus in realism or naturalism is the society and the external reality, whereas in modernism we focus on the inner self. The tone normally in naturalism it's objective or deterministic. In modernism it's like experimental. The style is normally clear and descriptive in realism. In modernism, we see symbolic and abstract, non-linear depiction of life or narration. Some of the important authors, of course, Twain's, James Crane, and Dresser. And in modernism, we will see later Ernest Hemingway and other key figures that we'll talk about in the next lesson. So here we reach the end of our lesson. I hope that it was useful. In the next episode, I'll talk about modernism in American literature. See you then.